cool ideas and sharing it with the outside world. When we moved into this space in 2015, we created the Bean to Bar Chocolate Lab. So that's kind of where I spend most of my time. And in the last 6 years or so, I've done a really deep dive into chocolate. We'll talk about chocolate a little bit towards the end, but that's just to let you know who I am. But let's get started. So today we are going to do our deep dive into brown butter. But we're going to take a few diversions along the way. So some things we're also going to talk about are just generally composition and structure of milk and other dairy products. We'll get into the mechanics of brown butter. I mean, it's a really simple, fundamental technique, right? But there's a lot of interesting things we can do with it, the better we understand it. And that's really, if I have one sort of mission in what I do as a chef, my role in education, I also spend a lot of time in the outside world doing all kinds of consulting. A lot of what I do is trying to convince people that the more we understand the makeup of our ingredients and how they function in recipes, it's really a source of great power for us as cooks. You know, there's kind of that cliche thing where, the savory cooks are, it's a pirate ship and it's cooking by feel, right? And then the pastry side, we're studious, we're scientific. I mean, there is some truth to that, I think, but I think you can apply that way of thinking to all cooking, really. And I really think of it on three different levels. The more we understand our ingredients, how they work in recipes, and some of the basic things that are happening, for lack of a better word, at a molecular level, it helps us in those three ways, which are we can just make better stuff, right? We should always be constantly refining, even stuff we think we know, by heart. We should always think of ways how we can maybe keep trying to make it better or maybe make it slightly different. But that knowledge also helps us fix mistakes, right? So if something goes wrong in a recipe, how do you know to fix it if you don't know what might have caused that problem? Before joining ICE, I was the pastry chef at a restaurant called Le Bernardin for 8 years. And that was usually the first thing that I did when I walked in at like 10, 11 a.m. before lunch started, is I would put out those fires because people would be going, "Chef, this didn't work. What went wrong?" I'm like, "Well, I wasn't standing over your shoulder when you were making it, but I know that the flour is acting this way or the fat is doing this, and did you mix things at a certain temperature?" And all of that is really important for troubleshooting. So making better stuff, fixing problems when they arise. And then thirdly, and you are kind of just starting out in this sort of evolution as cooks, but eventually that kind of knowledge can lead to creativity. And, I don't know that culinary creativity is the same as like, other arts where you're just walking down the street and you're suddenly hit with a flash of inspiration for a new dish. Usually it's a very deliberative process, right? There's a lot of trial and error that goes into it, testing, retesting. And sometimes when we understand how our ingredients or how a particular method works on a very base level, we can take that and apply it to something else, or we could maybe try to twist something in that original method to make something new. So it really helps us on those three levels. And again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a cook, but I try to think like a scientist, I guess. And part of that just involves like shrinking yourself down to try to imagine what's happening in our food on a level that we can't always see directly. So, by illustration of that here on the screen, I have some ice cream. So ice cream coming out of a machine. And then in the middle, we have a magnification of ice cream. And here we actually start to see some of the base elements. And it's always really important. We're going to do a little exercise. I'm going to show you an exercise at the very end of how to maybe approach ingredients or even more complex combinations of ingredients by kind of thinking of them at their most basic level. And here, ice cream, what's it made up of? Forget even that. Forget milk, sugar, glucose, stabilizer, blah, blah, blah. At its most basic, ice cream is water, okay? It's fat. It's solids that aren't fat. It's air, right? Because when we freeze a sorbet or an ice cream, we're freezing it dynamically. We're incorporating air into it as it's freezing. And then that water, some of it's frozen, right? By definition, ice cream, that water is obviously ice, right? We could get into a whole diversion on ice cream for like 9 hours, but I'll try to keep it short. But what's really fascinating is that in an ice cream or in a sorbet as well, even at freezer temperature, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, about 20% of that water is still liquid. What could cause that? Well, what's another ingredient that we put into our ice cream besides milk and cream? Sugars, right? Sugars lower the freezing point of water, and if they didn't do that, ice cream would be rock hard. We'd never be able to scoop it or put a spoon through it. So what we see here are, it might be a little small for you, but like where you see the A, that's an air bubble. You see a little F pointing to little individual fat particles that are creating almost like a scaffold-like structure around those air bubbles that have been incorporated. And then you see those sort of flat planes. There's one that has a C on it. Those are the ice crystals. And then those kind of like little rivers running through all of that, that's the liquid water, right? So now all of a sudden, I'm looking at ice cream in a new way. I'm thinking of it at its most basic components and how it's composed and what ingredients are supplying those basic aspects. If we magnify ourselves up even further, there on the right is a single fat particle. And it has like a little line there, 1.0, with what kind of looks like a funky UM. That UM stands for a micron, and that's very small. So a micron is a millionth of a meter, which is kind of hard to just wrap your head around, right? Another way of expressing that is a thousandth of a millimeter. So very, very, very small. So again, stuff we can't see with our naked eye, but if we can think about these, if we can think about cream or milk or anything that has milk fat in it, and we can shrink ourselves down conceptually, we can understand, you know, the functionality of things like fat a little bit better. So we're going to focus on brown butter, which is basically, you know, one of the most fundamental techniques you can think of, right? We'll make some live here in a minute. But it has its limitations. So what I also want to kind of talk about today is sort of my own evolution of thinking about brown butter, loving it as a flavor, and then having problems with it when I tried to adapt it to other things, but then having to come up with solutions. And again, all of that really was based on understanding what's happening when we're cooking butter to the brown stage, what butter is made up of, where butter comes from, and that ultimately led, and this happened over the course of a few years, that ultimately led to coming up with new ideas, that creative aspect, right? So we're going to start with butter, but where does butter come from? Cream, right? So butter comes from cream. Where does cream come from? Milk, right? So we're going to take a little bit of a diversion away from brown butter specifically, and then open it up a little bit more to talk about milk. And to me, milk is really fascinating. I used to do sort of like a professional level class years ago. The title was The Humble Complexity of Milk. Maybe a little too academic, but if you think about it, milk is kind of special in several ways. We have certainly our own sort of physiological and even psychological, nostalgic connections to milk and dairy products. It's also interesting that along with honey, milk is the only thing that I can think of that exists solely as food. You know, yes, plants, where animals eat plants, but the plants they have their own thing going on. And obviously, you know, the food chain, but milk is really the only thing, in addition to honey. So honey is just food that bees store themselves that we selfishly steal from them, which is kind of weird when you think about it on that level. But milk is really interesting in that sense. And in the kitchen, it's such a ubiquitous ingredient. We use it all the time. Outside of the kitchen, we consume it probably every day, but we don't really think too much about what it's made up of and how it works, especially when we get into all the different fractions of milk, cream and butter and milk powder and sweetened condensed milk. So it's helpful to think about what it's made up of. So like most things, milk is mostly made up of water, roughly 88%. Milk fats, somewhere between 3 and 4%, but we can say on average about 3.5%. And then we have all the solids that aren't fat. That's predominantly protein in the form of casein and whey, as well as lactose. So who can tell me when you have the letters OSE at the end of an ingredient word, what does that OSE kind of mean? It's a sugar, right? So we think of granulated sugar as sugar. A lot of times when I write recipes, I nerd out and I call it sucrose because that's what it actually is. And we use lots of other types of sugar in the kitchen. But lactose is a sugar, right? That's actually also what is the culprit for people who are, have sensitivity to dairy products. And it's kind of an interesting idea to consider that as adults, we're not meant to consume milk or dairy products, right? We're meant to consume it when we're babies. After a certain point in our childhood, our body actually stops producing the enzyme that breaks down lactose. So in theory, we should all be lactose intolerant. But there's a couple different theories that, thousands of years ago, there was a genetic mutation that kept that enzyme turned on. Which means today, most of us, 95% of us can consume dairy products with no problem. Or just as humans started to move around the planet into different environments, there was just a biological imperative to evolve to remain lactose tolerant for nutrition, right? Interesting kind of theories to kind of dig into. In addition to all the other in addition to the protein and the lactose, we have all the stuff that's good for us, right? Minerals, vitamins, et cetera, et cetera. It's also interesting to think about the structure of milk. And we can actually express the structure of milk in 3 different ways. It's an emulsion, or at least after homogenization. So has anyone ever had like raw milk straight from a cow? A few people, right? What happens if you let that sit after you milk the cow and you let that milk just sit for a while? It's going to separate, right? Because the fat is less dense than the water it's floating around in, so it's going to separate. That's not really commercially acceptable. So virtually all the dairy products that we're going to use in a kitchen, it's been pasteurized and then homogenized, which means the fat's been broken up into tiny little droplets, so it can't really come out of suspension. So we call that an emulsion, right? Where you have 2 things that don't like to be mixed together. So milk is an emulsion, but it's also a suspension, meaning there's just solid stuff just floating around. So in addition to the fat, some of the proteins are, like I said, just literally floating around in the water and the milk, but it's also a solution. So some of the proteins and all of the lactose, it's soluble in water, so it's actually dissolved in the water in the milk. So sometimes thinking about that internal structure of our ingredients can also be helpful in understanding how it works in certain applications. 88% water, right? Almost all of our ingredients are mostly made up of water. Fruits, vegetables, meats, etc. So I often think that most of cooking is mostly about controlling water, right? We're trying to get rid of it. We're trying to hold on to it, by cooking something without drying it out, or we're trying to change its structure. Maybe we're using a hydrocolloid or gelatin to take liquid water and turn it into a novel solid. Or in the case of ice cream, we're taking liquid water and we're turning it into ice, but in a very controlled way. So water, it's one of those things, once you start thinking about it, every time you cook something, you're thinking about the water in it, right? If I'm cooking a carrot, I'm thinking about the water. If I'm cooking a steak, or if I'm making ice cream, for example. So this is kind of an interesting comparison. The water content of a handful of fruits and vegetables that we use all the time, compared with the water content of whole milk as well as skim milk and heavy cream. So if we take, that, for example, a stalk of celery, right? A stalk of celery is pretty solid, okay? But it has way more water than very fluid liquid milk, right? And that's kind of also a weird thing to wrap your head around. Now, if you were to stick that stalk of celery into a juicer, you'd immediately see that, yes, it's mostly water, like 94% water. But with milk and other dairy products, what's kind of fascinating to consider is that more of that water is displaced because, again, what is its role in nature? Its role is as food, right? So it has to have a lot of energy and a lot of nutrition in order to fulfill its function. But, again, looking at a potato, a very solid potato at 80% water content, heavy cream that's fluid and pourable, has a lot less water. And again, there's a lot of other stuff there taking up this place of that water. So in addition to water, we have the fat. What does fat do? It does lots of wonderful things. Technically fat doesn't have a flavor, but it can carry flavors. It gives us a sensation of moisture, it's lubricating the palate as we eat things, right? In some cases, like whipped cream and ice cream, it's contributing a lot to that physical structure of that food. The non-fat solids, even though it's only 8 or 9% of the total of the milk, that's very important, plays a lot of important roles, and that's one we're going to kind of zero in on a little bit later. And again, it's roughly half protein and half lactose. Thinking about lactose as a sugar, it's interesting because it has some properties that are very similar to sucrose, regular granulated sugar. But there's one really interesting aspect that's quite different, and that's what we call sweetening power. So this is going to be kind of maybe small for you guys to read, but this is like, at some point in my career, stuff like this, these kind of charts, is like gold to me. I constantly refer to them. This is one that I actually created myself over a long period of time, kind of cross-referencing from different sources. But there's a lot of information on here. But if you can see it, you'll see at the very top we have sucrose, and then we have a column about molecular weight, which we'll talk about in a second, and then you have sweetening power. So at some point in the last century, some food scientists got together and says, well, we have all these different sweeteners, all these different sugars, and they all have different sweetness levels. We need to quantify that. So because sucrose is the sweetener that's most commonly used in cooking, somebody decided to give that a score of 100, okay? And we all know the relative sweetness of a spoonful of sugar. Some are higher than 100. So if we look at, say, honey, that usually clocks in at like 125 or 130. So gram for gram, honey is like 30% sweeter than sucrose. And then you have things like glucose or corn syrup that might be half as sweet. So especially for the pastry students, how many of you have made it so far where you say you've made pâte de fruits? Okay. Did you guys taste the glucose syrup you used? Okay. If you didn't, you should. We should taste all of our ingredients, even if it comes out of a bucket, right? But you can really see the difference in sweetness when you taste them side by side. So lactose is way less sweet. Lactose clocks in at about 15 or 16 relative to 100 for sucrose. So what's interesting is when we're using lactose in pastry applications or savory applications, we're not thinking about the lactose really providing much in the way of sweetness. However, and again, I try not to make too many diversions, but if you go back and you look at that first column that says molecular weight, I'm not a chemist, so So I'm not even going to attempt to explain what molecular weight means. But that number correlates to, remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that in ice cream and sorbet, sugars lower the freezing point of water. And that number is really important. That correlates to how much a sugar will affect the freezing point of water. And you see that regular sucrose and lactose are the same. So if I'm making an ice cream, obviously there's a lot of milk and or cream in that ice cream. I'm not worried about the lactose. I'm not even thinking about it in terms of its contribution to sweetness, but I do have to consider its contribution to texture, the freezing point, the consistency, the firmness, or the hardness. Okay. Also interesting to just compare different compositions of different dairy products. 95% of the time we're using cow's milk, but increasingly we're seeing sheep's milk and goat's milk in kitchens. Buffalo, obviously, traditionally used in mozzarella. And then you look at, you wonder, like, how do you get milk from a mouse? But actually, it's kind of interesting. If you look really briefly at whale and seal, look at the fat content, like 40+%. But if you think about the environment in which those animals live, they need that fat as insulation from the cold water where they live, which is kind of interesting. It's also interesting to look at how the composition changes when we take things away. When we take the fat away and have skim milk, everything else goes up. When we concentrate the fat, as in the case of heavy cream, everything else goes down. So that's really important. So as we continue to talk, we're going to pay particular attention at that column, the non-fat milk solids, which, to help you visualize, you can pass that around. It's basically milk powder. We've all probably seen milk powder. We've all used milk powder. It's actually a very useful ingredient in the kitchen. But when we're thinking about non-fat milk solids, it doesn't have to be abstract. We can just think of it as non-fat milk powder. Okay. So let's do a little exercise here. In the mixer, I have some heavy cream. So on this chart, I have some just different sort of levels of cream that we typically find, half and half. Where does it get that name? You could replicate it by essentially taking equal parts heavy cream and milk and combining them. That comes in at about 11% fat. Light cream is not something we find a lot here in the US, but that gets close to 20. What I have in the bowl and what we tend to use in the kitchen the most is a 35 or often 36% cream. And then we have a 40% cream. So you might think, why does that matter? Especially if I'm talking about the difference between 36 and 40. It actually is very important in the sense that if I'm doing something where the fat content has to be precisely dialed in, say I'm making a ganache or I'm making an ice cream, all of my recipes are typically formulated for a 36% fat. If I substitute a 40%, things could go wrong very quickly because I have too much fat and the recipe would be imbalanced. And I've been in many situations where I've written recipes or I've done consulting projects where I write the recipes for 36% fat and I show up and in the kitchen they have 40. In some cases, that's not a big deal, but like I said, if I'm making ice cream or ganache, I have to pull out my calculator and reformulate that recipe to account for just that slight 4% difference. Okay. So I'm whipping this cream. And if I were to ask you, if we're making whipped cream, and I were to ask you to try to quantify or explain the characteristics of perfectly whipped cream in the sense that it has the most possible air whipped into it and it has the strongest structure. What kind of words might you use to describe the consistency of the cream? So I'm hearing stiff, which is intuitive, right? The stiffer it is, that must mean it's the strongest, right? That's actually not true. This right here is what I would consider perfectly whipped cream. It is not holding a stiff peak whatsoever, right? Actually, once we get to a stiffer consistency, which I'll allow to happen here. Once we get to a stiffer consistency, we've actually started to knock air out of it. So it's actually more dense. And to explain the structure of whipped cream, again, think about what's in there. We have water, we have a lot of fat floating around, and then we have small amounts of protein and lactose. So if you can imagine, once I start moving that whip, imagine if we won't do it, but imagine if we all stood up and just started running around the room. We're gonna bump into each other, right? So what I like to call it like a mosh pit of milk fat is happening right now in this mixer. And what I was talking for maybe 45 seconds, and you see how quickly we went from what I consider perfect whipped cream, which is actually kind of a soft peak, to this is beyond stiff, now it's actually broken. So what happens, not only do we start to knock air out of it at a certain point, but we also start to jam so much of that fat together that the water that's in that cream has nowhere else to go. So we kind of almost break that emulsion, right? And it actually it takes on a grainy appearance. So I'm gonna keep going a little bit. So whipped cream, so these terms you see up here, flocculation is that natural tendency for the fat in milk or cream to float up to the surface if it's left undisturbed. And like I said, we homogenize those products to keep them dispersed and keep it emulsified. When we're making perfect whipped cream, what we're doing is we're creating partial coalescence of milk fat. Meaning, as we're running around, we're representing milk fat droplets in cream. As we're running around the room, we bump into each other. We stick together because cold milk fat is sticky. And as more and more of those droplets stick together, we actually create almost like a scaffold-like structure. And that's trapping the air that's being whipped in. And that's creating that perfect environment for the most volume and the strongest structure. But as we start to jam more of that fat together into what we call full coalescence, that water has nowhere to go and it breaks. So I'm intentionally breaking this. We decided not to use the cameras up top, but it's changed a lot just in the last minute or two. It's definitely more yellow in color. I've pretty much knocked out all of that air, and it's actually completely broken. I'm not gonna pass it around, but I'll try to give you a sense of what happened. Okay, so how many of us have ever made butter from heavy cream? Are my pastry students, are we still doing that in like lesson 6, mod 1? Okay. So that was actually something I added to the curriculum because when I was at Le Bernardin as pastry chef, we actually made our own butter every single day. Not to cook with, but just for bread service. So we would do this in the big, 20-quart Hobart with a case of cream at a time. So I would probably keep going for a few more minutes, but since we're not really talking about making butter, I'll stop. But what I would do is I would take this mixture, pass it through some cheesecloth. Whoop. And then we actually drain out not all, but most of that water that was in the original cream to begin with, right? And then, the process of making butter, it's squeezing all this liquid out, but also what we call washing it. So we dunk it in ice water to remove more of it. And the more we kind of knead it and massage it, it gets kind of nice and smooth and creamy. So let's take a look at this liquid that's being drained out. It's pretty milky, right? Does anybody know what we call this liquid? Buttermilk, right? So most people, if you were to taste this, it wouldn't taste anything like buttermilk we buy in the store, which is actually like skim milk that has an acid added to it to culture it and give it a little bit of tanginess, right? This would just taste like skim milk. But its milky color tells us there's a lot of the solids that are suspended in the water, in the cream or milk, that are basically drained away from the butter. So what does that mean? Let's think back. Let's look at this. When we go from 35% cream, we've got 6% of those non-fat milk solids. Once we turn that cream into butter, we're down to 2, okay? So keep that in mind, that again, every time we concentrate something, we go from cream that was 35% fat to butter that's 82+%. We lose something. We lose a lot of water, but we also lose some of those non-fat milk solids. Okay. That's a little illustration of the structure of whipped cream. And what did we do when we made that butter? We took an emulsion, cream, we broke it and then re-emulsified it and swapped the nature of that emulsion. In the cream, it was fat dispersed in water, and now in our butter, it's water dispersed in fat. So let's talk about the topic at hand, brown butter. I have in a pan here some butter that I'm going to start to cook and melt further. How many of us have made brown butter that we know of? Okay, most of us. But in a sense, almost any time we add a dairy product to a baked good, in a sense, we're browning butter. We're just browning the butter that's in that dough or batter or whatever it is we're making. But let's talk about brown color and flavor, because a lot of times when we're talking about browning in food, we don't always use the correct terminology. A lot of times when we cook things and it turns brown, we use the word caramelization, which happens when we caramelize sugar, but you don't really caramelize a crust on a steak, or you don't caramelize the crust on a pizza. The temperatures aren't getting nearly as high for caramelization, because caramelization, its textbook definition, is when you heat sugar so high that it basically starts to break down and decompose. But decomposing sugar tastes really good, so we utilize that a lot. And what is that flavor? It's almost kind of hard to describe what caramel is, right? It's kind of toasty, it's kind of nutty, it's kind of bitter. There's still a little bit of sweetness there. But caramelization, just important to remember that it happens just with sugar and at very high temperatures, approaching 320 degrees, okay? Most of the browning that happens in most of the foods that we cook is a completely different chemical reaction that we now refer to as Maillard reactions. And that's when you have protein, certain kinds of sugar, you have heat and the removal of water, but that heat is much, much lower. Generally, Maillard reactions can begin as low as 200 degrees. In some circumstances, they actually happen at room temperature, in very special circumstances. So two very different bits of chemistry that give us kind of similar things, but basically they turn components in our food brown that creates flavor, right? This was named after a French chemist, Louis Camille Maillard. And it's a relatively recent sort of observation. He kind of discovered these reactions only about 100 years ago. So again, what we need for Maillard reactions are we need protein. We need certain types of sugar. Lactose is one of them. We need heat, and usually with heat you have evaporation, you have the removal of water. So at least those of you in the front row, you can hear my butter is making noise, right? It's sizzling. What is the sound of sizzling? What does that represent? It's water boiling, right? And it's more specifically, it's a little bit of water that's boiling out of mostly fat. I don't recommend you ever do this, but if you ever, have a pot of oil and you get a drop of water in it, what does it do? It sputters and crackles, right? Exactly. So what's happening with my butter? Remember, what's in my butter? I have fat, I have a little bit of water, and I have 2% by weight non-fat milk solids, protein, and lactose. So I have all the ingredients here for what we call these Maillard reactions. And again, you can't see it, but basically what I have here is I have a yellow liquid, which is my milk fat, and I have some stuff floating at the top. Those are my milk solids. If we were to skim those solids off, what do we have? We have clarified butter, right? So probably about the time that I stop hearing that sizzle, that tells me that all the water's been removed. And because water boils at 212 degrees, once the water's gone, the actual temperature of the fat can jump up above 212 degrees. Okay? Also, you see up here on the screen, increase of pH. It's not necessary. Well, what does pH mean? What does it measure? Measures acidity, right? Acidity or alkalinity. 7 is neutral. If it's above 7, it's alkaline. If it's below 7, it's acidic. If you increase the pH of whatever you're cooking, you can actually amplify these Maillard reactions. What's like the classic preparation where we add an alkaline to, we don't even add it to the dough, but we treat the surface of the dough with an alkaline. Has anyone ever made a pretzel? Mod 2, pretzel and bagel day, right? Awesome day. You're boiling that proofed knotted pretzel in an alkaline solution, and that increase of pH gives it that really dark pretzel-y color and flavor. So in a sense, pretzel color and flavor are these Maillard reactions on steroids. I'm starting to hear a little subsiding of my boiling sound. I always want to keep this moving to keep those solids suspended, otherwise they're going to sink to the bottom and they're not going to brown nicely, they're just going to burn. So I'm going to keep an eye on that, but pretty much all the water is gone, so now the temperature can increase. I'll turn my heat up just a little bit. I'm sorry? I can. We can somehow make that work. All right, so again, some of you up front close might actually start to smell the flavor change. I can definitely start to see a little bit of browning. And again, I want to make sure I keep this moving to keep those solids suspended. And I'm even going to cut off the heat. Even though I cut off the heat, it's still going to kind of carry over and brown a little bit more. I'm going to very carefully pour into a glass. So I want you to kind of be able to see it's going to take a minute to settle. I would pass it around, but it's 300 and some degrees, or 200 and something degrees. You know, that's kind of like an actual interesting thing that could fuel creativity. Brown butter poured into a pint glass looks like beer. How can I play off of that? I'm going to use that. But now what you see, remember, like you can kind of see as it settles, those solids are settling to the bottom. And remember, all of that color and flavor is just coming from 2%, just 2% of the weight of that original butter, okay? And again, the stuff that turned brown is essentially the non-fat milk solids, protein and lactose. So one of my favorite applications for brown butter is financier. Is everyone familiar with a financier? If you know, people ask you, what's your desert island book or movie? If I had a desert island pastry, I could do without pretty much anything, but just give me financier for the rest of my life. To me, brown butter defines the flavor of a financier. Secondary would be the almond. But you can get creative. I mean, I myself have made duck fat financier and olive oil financier and some I probably forgot about. I think though, once you lose the brown butter flavor, it kind of ceases to be a financier. So there's that. So remember, we're comparing caramelization and these Maillard reactions, what's responsible for brown butter. Very different chemistry, very different temperatures. So let's take two things that are kind of similar, but made in different ways. So we're all probably familiar with caramel sauce, right? How do we make caramel sauce? We caramelize sugar, meaning we're cooking sugar till it breaks down and decomposes, turns brown. And then we add cream and butter, and then we have caramel sauce. Has anyone ever made dulce de leche before? How would a Mexican grandmother make dulce de leche? Probably not boil in the can. Okay, before there was sweetened condensed milk, basically what you do is you'd have an open pot, you'd have milk and sugar, and you just slowly reduce that onto the stove until you've evaporated away enough water where the milk solids in the milk start to brown. That's dulce de leche, right? Yes, we kind of have a modern day hack where even though it says on the label, do not do it, we can put a can of condensed milk submerged in water and boil it for like 3 hours. We open it up, we have beautiful dulce de leche, okay? On the surface, dulce de leche, caramel sauce, they're kind of the same. But when you realize how differently they're made, we can start to maybe understand the differences, taste the differences especially. So here's another interesting example. So sweetened condensed milk, how most of us would make dulce de leche today. The composition of sweetened condensed milk, we have water, we have solids. The solids include fat, but then we have sugar, and we have non-fat milk solids, right? So compared to regular milk, where the non-fat solids are like 8 to 9%, sweetened condensed milk has a lot of the water removed, so that number jumps up to 23. Let's compare that with something else we use a lot in the pastry kitchen, white chocolate. So obviously there's no cocoa butter in the condensed milk, but there is milk fat, and there is sugar, and there are non-fat milk solids. So how do you make white chocolate? You take cocoa butter, sugar, and instead of actually using non-fat milk powder, typically we use whole milk powder, which has the protein, the lactose, but also the fat. But interesting to notice is that those two things, sugar and the non-fat milk solids, are pretty close in a can of condensed milk, and for an example, Valrhona's white chocolate. So, interesting story. You know, this was about 15 years ago now. Every pastry chef on the planet and their uncle was taking chocolate, putting it in a hotel pan, and roasting it in the oven. It was a super trendy thing. Roasted white chocolate. A lot of people called it caramelized white chocolate, although knowing what we know, it's not true caramelization. Although, to be fair, sometimes Maillard reactions and caramelization can happen at the same time in the same product, just at different stages. But this was kind of born out of, at least to me, I can point to the sort of the R&D pastry chefs at Valrhona in France. They told the story where they had a bowl of white chocolate and they would leave it on top of an oven to keep it melted or something like that, and they forgot about it. And they came back to it like 2 weeks later, and they noticed that the white chocolate had started to turn brown. Now, most of us would instinctively say, oh, we just scorched our white chocolate, we throw it away. But like good inquisitive chefs, they tasted it. They're like, oh, it actually tastes pretty good. You could argue it actually makes white chocolate taste like something, right? And they were smart enough to realize what happened was heat. You have this melted white chocolate sitting in a hot place for a long period of time. What's in it? We have protein and lactose in the form of our non-fat milk solids that are added to the white chocolate. And that browning was basically the same thing we just did with our brown butter, or what happens when we make dulce de leche. So that started this trend of chefs roasting their white chocolate. And I did it too. Then a few years later, what happened is Valrhona, others have come out since, but Valrhona, I don't think we need all of them anyway. Valrhona released a caramelized white chocolate that they call dulce, sort of a play off of dulce de leche. So what I'm passing around is actually Calibo's version of that. They just call it gold. But it's basically the same thing that you would get if you were to roast white chocolate in the oven. Let's take another diversion slightly away from brown butter proper. Going back to pastry mod 1, lesson 6. If you didn't make butter, hopefully you did make salted caramels. And this recipe is in that lesson for this very reason, to show the technique of caramelization. So to make these kind of classic salted caramels, we caramelize sugar. We add cream and glucose and some invert sugar, and then we cook it to a final temperature. So the color and flavor is coming mostly from caramelization, but because we have dairy products, as it climbs in temperature above 200 degrees to its final temperature of about 245 to 248, you also get some Maillard reactions happening. So I figured I would also make you some salted caramels to try. You can pass it around. There's another application that's very similar that I add chocolate to. And the result, at least you can tell me what you think, the result to me is almost like a refined version of a Tootsie Roll. But here I'm not caramelizing the sugar at all. I'm taking everything in a pot except for the sugar, or except for the chocolate, and I'm cooking it to that same final temperature, like 248 Fahrenheit, and then I'm pouring it over the chocolate like a ganache. But when I get that to that temperature, like the color is like a nice tan brown color. So the caramel flavor, in addition to the chocolate flavor, and these chocolate caramels, is not coming from caramelization, but from those Maillard reactions. So you can pass that around too. So a lot of times when we're cooking, we want these things to happen. We want flavor to be created, right? And now we know every time we make brioche, part of that nice dark brown crust is due to the fact that there's butter and milk in the brioche, right? We could even extend that to meat, right? We sear a steak and we get a nice kind of caramelized char on that. It's not caramelization, it's actually Maillard. There's actual burning happening, pyrolization. But think about what's in the meat. We have protein, obviously. A lot of people don't think about it, but there are sugars in meat. So for example, there's a sugar in beef known as ribose, OSE, it's a sugar, right? The sweetening power is like 3, it's very low, but it behaves like a sugar. So you have protein, you have sugar, you have really intense heat, and that browning of a seared steak is Maillard reaction. If you were to take that steak and boil it in water, the water is only going to get to 212 degrees. You're not going to get warm enough to create those Maillard reactions, plus you're not removing any water. So if you boil a steak, it's just going to be what? Gray, right? It's not going to have nearly the same flavor. So most of the time when we're cooking, we want these Maillard reactions. We want flavor. Sometimes we don't. So this was a project I started working on years ago. One of my other part-time jobs as a pastry chef is I do some brand ambassador work for Boiron, the fruit puree company. We've probably seen them in the classroom kitchens here. I wanted to make fruit-based caramels, the same texture as the traditional, salted caramel, but without the caramel flavor. I wanted to really highlight both the color and the flavor of the fruit. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And what I realized is I could take that same recipe, literally the same proportion of ingredients that I use in the salted caramel, put it all in a pot together without caramelizing the sugar, and just add fruit puree on top of it and cook it to the final temperature. And that's what I end up with here. So I just have a bunch of these lying around, so I thought I'd share these with you. I have raspberry. I aim to please. I have mango and passion fruits. Okay, and this one you can choose which one you want. I didn't have enough for everybody of both, but I have white peach and I have blackberry. But again, the white peach, like it's preserving the color. Like my goal is not to get any browning or not to get too much of those Maillard flavors, right? So again, it's understanding what the components of the recipe and the composition of the recipe, but also the method behind it, and just altering it to give me something new and different. Now, one piece of equipment I do have in the lab that I probably don't use enough because it takes a lot to set it up, but I actually have what's called a vacuum cooker. And this is pretty interesting, right? So what it does is it allows me to cook in negative pressure. It might be kind of hard to see there, but it's basically, imagine a pot with a seal. And then it has a little stirrer that I can insert into it, so it stirs it while it cooks. Because it's got a seal top on it, I can't stir it while it's got all the air, or not all the air, but most of the air sucked out. So has anyone ever used a pressure cooker? Okay, so that's positive pressure. You're building up pressure. What does that do? It raises the boiling point. But when you take away pressure, when you have negative pressure, you're creating a vacuum, it actually lowers the boiling point. So almost all, I guarantee you, almost all of the commercial mass market candies, confections, hard candies especially, that you would ever buy in a bodega or a candy store or whatever, I guarantee you that those were cooked in some sort of vacuum. Because when you lower the boiling point, you can remove water at a much lower temperature. And you can avoid getting too close to things like caramelization. You know, so hard candy, I don't know, can anybody tell me if you're making like a hard candy, like a lollipop? Can anybody tell me what temperature you cook your sugar syrup to? Around 300. 300 plus a couple degrees. Basically, 300 is where you've removed all the water and you just have pure sugar. But remember, caramelization is just a couple degrees higher than that. It starts just above 300 and really kicks in around 320. So, you know, if I'm making a pineapple lollipop, you know, I want it to have a nice, clear color. I don't want it to look brown. So cooking it under a vacuum allows us to remove the same amount of water, but instead of at 300 degrees, it might be 250 degrees. So I have done these fruit caramel experiments in the vacuum cooker. And instead of cooking to, say, 248 degrees at what we call atmospheric pressure at sea level, which we're about, I don't know, 20 feet above sea level at the moment, 248. In the vacuum cooker, I can achieve that same thing around 190 degrees. So I avoid those Maillard reactions altogether. So really cool piece of equipment. It's not something, unfortunately, that is really practical that you'd see in everyday kitchens, but maybe one day. So we've covered so far just sort of the general composition and structure of milk, from which we get cream, from which we get butter. 2% of that butter is made up of those non-fat milk solids that when we heat it and remove the water, we get this beautiful brown color and this wonderful nutty aroma that we can apply into things like financier. We see the same effects in some of the confections that we make. Actually, I saw on the table today butter crunch from one of the pastry classes. What's that recipe? It's sugar and butter and corn syrup, I think, or glucose. And it's cooked to just about 300 or just over, right? So not quite caramelization, but it's got that slight brown color because you added butter, which will give us that brown color and flavor, okay? So we see, once we realize what's happening, we see the results in almost everything we cook, okay? So I became obsessed with the flavor of brown butter. I mean, we're going way back now. 25 years. So early on in my career as a pastry chef, I was still working in Detroit, Michigan, where I'm from. So this is a couple years before I moved to New York. And was making financier, and I came across, and again, late 90s, kind of still early days of the internet. And one of the chefs that, I was following a lot of chefs at the time, just like young cooks do today. I was following all the Michelin-starred chefs in Europe, certainly in France. And this guy, I think some people have kind of come to, more contemporary cooks have kind of come to overshadow, him in influence, but they were all influenced. Everybody we talk about today was certainly influenced by this guy, Michel Bras, who had a Michelin 3-star restaurant in the south of France. I think it's now run by his son. And even though it was early days of the internet, some of these like Michelin 3-star chefs had amazing websites, especially for the time. And some of them had recipes. And I just happened to notice that Michel Bras' website had a recipe for a brown butter ice cream, glace au beurre noisette. And I love brown butter flavor, right? So I looked at the ice cream recipe, translated it, and it was really convoluted. It was made with skim milk, so no whole milk, no heavy cream, skim milk, which remember has no fat in it. The sugar was slightly caramelized. So caramelized sugar, then you add the milk. It had a ton of egg yolks in it, like a lot of ice cream recipes do. And then it had cornstarch, like a lot of cornstarch. Because and you needed all of that cornstarch and all of those egg yolks to bind the finished ice cream together, because it had a ton of just straight up brown butter. Okay, so let's think about that. We made whipped cream, right? We created that mosh pit of milk fat. The milk fat was whizzing around, hitting each other, and then sticking together and creating that scaffolding that we call whipped cream. Ice cream, the structure is nearly identical. Actually, let me go back. So this is whipped cream. The big blue spheres are air bubbles. That kind of scaffolding-like structure are the partially coalesced droplets of milk fat. And then like the little raspberry things kind of floating around there, those are actual proteins, the casein proteins. And they actually kind of help secure that scaffolding in a sense. Ice cream is almost exactly the same. The only difference is you have sugar and you have some of the water turned into ice. But I should have put it on here, but I actually have a diagram that basically looks the same, but you just see some ice cubes kind of thrown in there as well. So it makes sense then that if I have an ice cream that I put into the machine, right, and it spins as it freezes, if I overspin that ice cream, if I over whip it, I could do the same thing that happened when I over whipped the cream. I could essentially break it, kind of give it a gritty texture. Basically, I've made sweetened frozen butter is basically what I've done, right? And I found, as much as I love the flavor of this Michel Bras recipe, I found that if I left it in the machine a minute too long, it was a grainy mess when it came out. But I persisted. I made it. It was part of my menu, and I just was very careful about how I went about it. If we look here, this is like one sample formulation of what ice cream could be. And actually in this country, ice cream is defined as minimum 10% milk fat. But we also have like things like gelato, which are a little bit less. Sometimes they're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% fat. That's actually the style I prefer. And you can see, you can imagine if I have an unbalanced recipe that has too much milk fat in it, and we could actually go up to like 15, 16, no problem. Like your super premium supermarket brands, like a Haagen-Dazs, that's probably like 15% milk fat. But once you go above that, and you're not careful, you can end up with that grainy mess in the machine. part of that is also, also in this time period, 15 years ago, I was also learning a lot about technical aspects of ice cream. So I knew when an ice cream was done. Here's another question. If you're spinning ice cream, how do you know when it's done? Like, you look at it? Temperature, exactly. And the ice cream machines we use here at the school are great because they're one of the few ice cream machines that actually tell you the temperature of the mix inside. So when the temperature gets down to, in most cases, about -5 Celsius, can't do the conversions in my head at the moment, that's when you pull it. Because that's also consistent. If you do it just by looks, that's very subjective, and your ice cream can be different every time. But I wanted to perfect brown butter ice cream, and I knew, as much as I loved and worshipped Michel Bras, that wasn't the solution, okay? So I had a chance meeting with a chef who some of you may have heard of before, but he kind of faded from like the culinary scene quite a few years ago. But at his height, he was like one of the most inventive chefs here in New York City, a guy named Rocco DiSpirito. And I was still working in Michigan at the time, and we did a lot of guest chef dinners. You name a chef who was big from 1998 to 2004, they came through our restaurant. And we had a dinner. There was a bunch of New York chefs, actually, and Rocco was doing some sort of fish dish. And the great thing about guest chef dinners is it's great for the cooks who work at the restaurant because you can actually talk to the chef as they make their dish, and maybe you're assisting them. So I was doing my own dish. I was the pastry chef, but I saw him like doing something with a blender. He was adding this brown powder to something in a blender. I'm like, Chef Rocco, what are you working on? And he's like, oh, I'm making my brown butter emulsion. I'm like, well, where's the brown butter? He's like, oh, it says brown powder. I'm like, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. And he kind of clued me in to the birth of a technique that I kind of continued to refine on my own that made brown butter without using butter at all. Let's go back. Should have put these slides in multiple times. But let's look back at this chart. So regular whole milk, about 8.5% non-fat milk solids. Once we get to heavy cream, it's down to 6. Once we make that cream into butter, now we're down to 2% of the butter is the stuff that gives us flavor when we brown it, right? So what Rocco kind of explained to me is if you start with cream instead of butter, you automatically have the potentially 3 times more solid stuff that gives you flavor. Now, it's obviously a technique that takes a lot longer. Browning butter in a pan takes, like you saw, 3-4 minutes. Taking heavy cream, removing all of that water, which is 59% of its weight, takes a long time. But what he was able to produce was a powder that once you drained off that fat, you could actually separate it. Like if next time you brown butter, like look at it, all those little specks are so tiny. And even if I tried to strain it off, I would lose most of it because they're so tiny. But here in this technique, they clump up. So obviously I can't do this in real time for you, but I'm gonna pass this around. So I did this yesterday. So what I did is I took a quart of whole cream. I added maybe 80 grams of additional non-fat milk powder just to boost my yield even more. And then I slowly reduced it. Took me about 2 hours, stirring every few minutes. But I'm going to pass this around, and what you're going to see is the slow transition. I'll give it to you this way. So on the left, you have slightly reduced cream, and then as more and more of that water is evaporated off, you start to see first a yellowing. That just shows us that we're seeing mostly milk fat. And then we start to see the browning until we get to the point where it actually just separates into brown milk solids that we can strain off. And then essentially really, really delicious clarified butter that has the flavor of brown butter that we can use then in something else. But the idea here was to isolate just the solids in a greater quantity in a way we can separate it. So then I can make ice cream without adding all the fat as the original recipe that I found called for. Now I've seen people do some other things with that. I've seen people just simply toast the milk solids in some brown butter, and that works too. I don't think the quality of the flavor or the yield is exactly the same. I've even seen people just like with white chocolate, take the milk powder and toast it in the oven. Still, it doesn't have quite the same original brown butter flavor, but by reducing heavy cream, we get it. So I also saved what I made yesterday to show you that end result a little bit more. So again, this is just cream that's had all the water removed through very slow cooking. I use an induction so I can dial in the temperature so it's simmering, but it's not boiling over every 2 minutes. So here, we've just removed all the water, and at some point, like step 4 in that little progression, it separates into solids and fat. I mentioned clarified butter earlier. Has anyone ever heard of a product called ghee, G-H-E-E? I mean, ghee is kind of like clarified butter, but it's allowed some of those solids to brown a little bit, so it has a little bit more of that flavor. And that's basically what we produce here, like supercharged ghee. So using this in place of butter in a recipe is going to also give you some of that brown butter flavor, even though we don't have any of the solids. What I'll do is I'll use a cheesecloth to squeeze out as much of the fat as possible. Now, I can't guarantee that these brown milk solids are going to be 0% fat. I can't squeeze it all out. But I've been able, I estimate, again, knowing the composition of what I started with, if I measure everything that I'm finished with, I'm somewhere between a fat content between non-fat milk powder and whole milk powder. So maybe like 10% fat. So I'll pass this around. You can take a look at it up close. You can give it a smell. Once it's kind of cooled, it's like a crumbly, almost like a streusel appearance, like you see in the picture there. I refrigerate it. I mean, it could probably sit at room temperature, for a while, but I refrigerate it just for shelf life purposes. But again, this is just from a quart of cream and a small handful of non-fat milk powder. This was a little less than a pound of butter. A quart is 2 pounds of cream, right? So very different yield, same flavor, but very different composition now. So now that I have this, I can really maximize brown butter flavor without worrying about how much fat I'm adding. So now my ice cream dilemma was solved. So what I could do is I could just take a normal, white, or what we call a white base for gelato, or basically like a vanilla ice cream base, and I can just add this brown butter powder or brown milk solids, and I can make super smooth, balanced ice cream without worrying about overspinning it or a grainy texture. So once I figured that out, I think I'd already moved to New York by that point. Sorry, this is my timer to make sure I don't go over time. This was the first dish I think I put my brown butter ice cream onto. So we're talking circa 2005, 2006, which makes me feel really old saying that. But this was also a play on the word noisette. So bear noisette literally translates to like nut butter. because we generally recognize that flavor, that aroma of brown butter kind of has a nuttiness to it. So that's why we call it bear noisette. But noisette is also the word for hazelnut. So this was a dish that was hazelnut centric, a little caramelized banana, little praline cream, and our brown butter ice cream. Any questions? Too much information, not enough information? No, I don't see anybody sleeping, so that's good. What's your question? So the question was, when I was reducing the cream to make these brown milk solids, what was the temperature? I don't really keep a temperature of the cream itself. Now I have one of the fancy induction burners that I can set the temperature of the actual pan. And I find once I kind of get an initial boil, that I can maintain a simmer without it boiling over or scorching when the setting is at like 105 Celsius, which is like 215 Fahrenheit, something in that area. Yeah. But yeah, it's one of those projects where you have to babysit it. But the results are worth it, I think. One thing I haven't tried is doing it in a Thermomix. Are you guys familiar with a Thermomix? So a Thermomix is a blender originally made in Germany, I believe, Germany or Austria. And it's basically a blender that heats. And everywhere you go in Europe, every professional kitchen you go in Europe, they've got half a dozen of them. For some reason, they just never made one for North American, wattage power supply. So people would go to, like chefs would go to Europe and like bring back a Thermomix and then have adapters or have like an electrician try to rig it so it worked in our outlets, and with varying success. They finally made one for the US market, but never really marketed it to chefs, interestingly enough. They marketed it to home cooks. But also a really interesting machine because it's hands-free. You can stir things while cooking and you don't have to ever touch it. I can make lemon curd or pastry cream or creme anglaise, and I never have to stir it, right? I can set a precise temperature. The thing is with this, the thing I'm worried about doing it in the Thermomix is that at a certain point you want it to break. And if you have constant agitation or shearing, it might not actually break. So one of many, many experiments I have to play with. So let's grab that ice cream. So I made you a brown butter ice cream. And the formulation is pretty close to this. It's a gelato style, so it probably comes in at like a 7 or an 8%. And also, since we're talking about ice cream, I mentioned how that original formula had a lot of egg yolks in it. And that's something I kind of stopped doing years ago, either removing egg yolks entirely or reducing them a lot. When I started doing classes like ice cream and sorbet technology classes, I started doing comparative batches of like 4 or 5 vanilla ice creams, some with yolks, some without, different fat contents. And when you actually tasted them side by side, I found that the formulas I had used for years, they tasted like a frozen omelet. So I really scaled back on egg yolks. So this has no egg yolks either. But this was years in the development of really kind of perfecting that technique for the brown milk solids. And it never would have come without understanding the composition of these different dairy products. The fact that cream has 3 times the amount of flavor producing components than the butter does. So it was the understanding. It was the kind of nudge from another chef who was also working on the same technique, who understood that. In addition to ice cream, I've made brown butter ganache and never worried about the ganache breaking due to too much fat. So to bring us into more recent times, so since being here in Brookfield Place and having our chocolate lab, about half of my waking hours I'm thinking about chocolate in various degrees. And most of what we make is dark chocolate, single origin, or maybe a blend here and there, but it's mostly dark chocolate, single origin, and really kind of taking the approach of, well, let's really look at the process of making chocolate from raw cocoa beans, and seeing how the process itself really works and how it can be manipulated to change flavor, but also thinking about the beans themselves, because no two cocoa beans grown anywhere in the world are exactly alike, based on genetics or based on where they're grown. We'll get that started. But occasionally I do make milk chocolate. I'll make specialty things like gianduja. Is everyone familiar with gianduja? Everyone's probably familiar with Nutella. Okay, so gianduja is basically the highbrow version of gianduja or Nutella. And gianduja is basically where you add hazelnuts to the grinding process when you're making chocolate. So I'll do all kinds of specialty stuff. We've even made some white chocolate because we have a cocoa butter press where we can press our own cocoa butter. But I'm approaching chocolate making like a chef, like, well, how can I do things a little differently? How can I add flavors that... I'm sorry? It's funny. Because when I left like day-to-day restaurant work, there is that obvious path of like starting your own business, right? I actually love the idea of going into education because it still meant I could learn. And if I were a business owner, I would learn different things every day, but I'd probably stop learning or wouldn't learn as much. But I also ask myself, if I were to have my own business, what would it be? Because I can't decide. I like everything, So yes, I would absolutely open up a gelato shop. I'd open a chocolate shop. Actually, for a while, just before the pandemic hit, I had a dessert bar on the Upper West Side, in addition to all my other jobs, which was kind of insane. But so yeah, so chocolate, I'm learning the fundamentals of chocolate manufacturing, but also, like I said, approaching it from a chef's perspective of, well, how can we do it differently? Or, early on, I heard a chef say, if it's not broken, break it and see what happens. And then put it back together and see if you come up with something new. So when it comes to milk chocolate and my love of brown butter, I applied that to milk chocolate. I'm going to guess that's enough. If I need more, you just let me know. So if we look here at the screen, these are basic, this can vary a little bit. But if I'm making a dark chocolate, it's basically cocoa beans, or what we call cocoa mass, sugar, some added cocoa butter, maybe some lecithin for fluidity, and that's it. When we get to milk chocolate, we're adding milk, obviously. We can't add liquid milk to chocolate, or it would seize, as we all know, right? We've all had a little bit of water get into our chocolate. Question? Oh, you know what? That was a 1 a.m. last night cut and paste error.
I totally understand.
The first one is dark chocolate. Thank you for catching that. The second one, milk chocolate, we're incorporating milk, right? But it can't be in liquid form, it has to be in dried form. And we also, 5 more, we also want that milk fat. So whole milk powder that we generally use for milk chocolate and white chocolate is about 26% fat, in addition to the protein and lactose that's in there. So really, it wasn't too much of a stretch to realize, oh, this brown milk solids that I make from heavy cream, if I just squeeze out a little less fat, I can kind of replicate the composition of my whole milk powder. So that's basically what I've done. Usually in my 4-day classes, we do this as one of our batches. We do a brown butter, dark milk chocolate. So what's dark milk? So most milk chocolate, the cocoa percentage is going to be typically in a 30 to 40% range. Another quiz. Can somebody tell me what the percentage on a bar or bag of chocolate actually means? It's the amount of that chocolate by weight that comes from a cocoa bean. So that's the cocoa bean itself plus any additional cocoa butter we add. So most milk chocolates, the awesome ones, typically top out around 40%. But there is a trend in sort of the craft artisan chocolate world to exceed that, and people just started calling it dark milk chocolate. And at some point, it could be either a milk chocolate that just has more cocoa beans in it, or a dark chocolate that has a little bit of milk added to it. And that's what this ended up being. So this is a chocolate bar that has, in place of milk powder, it has our brown milk solids that are floating around somewhere. But also, I'm also thinking of ways to subtly add other flavors. And I thought it'd be interesting to incorporate maple sugar. And again, I can't use maple syrup because of the water, but if I use like crystallized maple sugar, that works just fine. So about 1/3 roughly of the sugar in this chocolate is maple. So it's not going to be like slap you in your face maple, but it's going to be a subtle maple that harmonizes with the brown butter, which hopefully harmonizes with the flavor of the cocoa beans that I use. And part of my work in chocolate has translated to other interesting work in the chocolate world. So I'm consulting for other chocolate makers and confectioners. And about a year ago, I started working on a project with the United Nations, where they asked me to help them identify small artisan chocolate makers who are making chocolate in countries where cocoa is grown. Why I went to Jamaica and Trinidad and Dominican Republic. So from November of last year into this spring, I was in the Caribbean for probably a total of about a month and a half, working with chocolate makers on those islands, and also visiting cocoa growers and understanding the cocoa sector of these very different countries, even though they're all in the Caribbean. So this dark milk, maple, brown butter chocolate, this comes in at about 54% cocoa solids. So again, higher than your typical milk chocolate. This was made from beans that I brought back from a visit with a farmer. The farmer's name, her name is Iluminada Ortega in northern Dominican Republic, but the company is named after her father, Florencio Ortega. And it's a gratuitous picture of me in their cocoa farm. So really cool to kind of blend these ideas that I continue to work with and refine over the years, like brown milk solids, and introduce it into new things that I'm getting into. So we're pretty much at time, but I'm going to take 2 minutes and kind of show you an interesting exercise. And this is something that really helped me develop these ideas of understanding what your ingredients are made up of, how they function in a recipe, how they're related to each other sometimes, the structure of our ingredients, And with that knowledge, I feel like I'm a better cook, and we can take this. It's so easily applied to milk because we can see its effects and all the things that we make. But you can do the same thing with flour and eggs and, of course, chocolate. And it's something that can be applied, with all the ingredients we use. So this is an interesting idea that was created by a guy named Hervé Tis, a French scientist. Tis spelled like the word this, T-H-I-S. I'm sure we've all probably heard of a term that, for better or for worse, kind of emerged maybe 20 years ago, molecular gastronomy. Sure. It's never been anybody's favorite term, but it kind of was a catch-all for people, chefs thinking scientifically or trying to create novel flavors and textures with new techniques, collaborations with scientists and chefs. So Hervé Tis was the guy who came up with that term, again, for better or for worse. But he's written a bunch of books, and I actually had an opportunity to collaborate with him on a project a few years ago. But he came up with this idea that he calls complex dispersed systems formalism. It's really simple. Basically, remember when we looked at ice cream under a microscope? If we take ice cream and we reduce it down to its most basic elements, air, fat, water, solids that aren't fat, that's about as far down as you can break it up. If we do that to anything, if we give those components a symbol, so in this case, air is a gas, that's G. O, you could say it was oil or fat. S is a solid. And then you can also describe relationships, like is something just mixed with? Is it emulsified or dispersed into something, et cetera, et cetera. It's jumping ahead of me. So if we look down at the bottom, we have O dispersed into W plus a gas. So fat dispersed into water plus a gas. That's a way of describing whipped cream, right? Because cream is fat dispersed into water, and we whipped it, incorporated air. But now let's take a step back, and what else can we plug into that? We could say, what if the fat was pistachio oil and the water was carrot juice, and we incorporated air? That could be cool. I don't know if it would taste good. Might look a little funky. I don't know if green and orange mixed together goes well. But it's an intellectual exercise to get you thinking outside the box, right? And you can maybe use that as that creative spark to say, okay, I know this about ingredient A. What if I applied it to ingredient B? We can refine that further. Let me make sure you're looking at the same thing I'm looking at. We can qualify that even more, and we can say, okay, we have fat or oil from cream that's dispersed into water at least 25%. We can't whip it half and half, right? Because it's only got 11% fat. But we can whip heavy cream, which is above 25% fat. It's 36% fat. And temperature is also important, right? If we try to whip warm cream, it kind of just goes straight to butter. So 4 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, we can keep refining that. So this is kind of a fun. I'll give you a hint. You just tasted it. And it's not chocolate. It's a way to express ice cream. So what do we have here? We have the air that's whipped in, what we call overrun, that's whipped into the ice cream as we spin it. We have the milk fat, at least in this country, minimum 10% milk fat to call it ice cream legally. You have all the solids, your sugars, your sucrose, your glucose, your stabilizer, et cetera. Your water that's in the dairy that you're using. So kind of an interesting way to break down things that are familiar to us, and then maybe insert things to try something new. at the very least, it's an intellectual exercise that could be interesting. That's all I got for you. Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time left in the room, but any other questions? What's that? Yeah, I mean, I found that at some point the egg yolks obscured flavors. You know, a little bit can be great in the right circumstance, but especially something like that with the brown butter, it's there, but it can be overtaken by the egginess, fruit flavors especially. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for your attention, and yeah, if you see me back in my corner playing with something, never hesitate to poke your head in and see what's going on.